Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Dairy Summit. My name is Todd Calloway, and we are very glad to have you for this event that's designed specifically for dairy nutritionists, where we're going to discuss the latest industry updates brought to you directly from the world's top dairy suppliers. So, our goal here is to provide you with everything you need to know to stay up to date on the latest research in the field without having to leave your home or your office. So, we believe this event will really help prepare you for market challenges. So, I'm Todd Calloway, and I'm a professor in animal and dairy science at the University of Georgia. And on behalf of the Wisenetics team, I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today. And this is going to be an afternoon full of knowledge and some valuable experiences from some great speakers. And we're really happy to have you with us. So I'm speaking from Athens, Georgia, in the US, but I'm sure we have people from all over the country and around the world joining us. So feel free to share where you are in the chat. We'd love to know where you are and sign in at any point. So I would like to thank, first of all, our sponsors who made this event possible: Agrarian Solutions, Agriplastics, Cow Manager, In Barn, Priority IAC, and Rangen Group. And last but not least, I really want to thank our speakers. We have a lot of expertise and knowledge in the industry to bring to this event, and I'm sure it's going to add a lot to your listening experience. So feel free to also use the chat, the YouTube chat, or whichever you can whenever you need help or have any questions. We have some technical people, and we'll have questions at the very end of every presentation. So we'll be able to take your questions and get them directly to the speakers. So without any more blather from me, let's get started, y'all. So our first guest of today is Dr. Jeffrey Firkins from The Ohio State University, who's going to discuss considerations for rumen modifiers for dairy cattle. And it's very rare for me to get to introduce one of my mentors in a lot of ways, even if he doesn't realize it. So Dr. Firkins, welcome, and we are glad to have you here.
Great to be here, Todd, and always a pleasure to hang with you. Am I all righty? There we go. And here is the presentation. There you go. So I want to, first of all, thank everyone for inviting me. And with a relatively short presentation like that, I've had to choose certain things to talk about. There's a lot more references and other details in a paper that I published a few years back with Kelly Mitchell. That's down at the bottom. So I'd like to talk about using rumen, especially rumen effective additives, and start with this pyramid here where you see anecdotal evidence on the bottom. Our goal really is to get up to the top to make sure that if you're considering additives that you're kind of at least having controlled situations, and especially if you have statistics to be able to account for variation, including especially peer review. And so that's kind of where I'm going to put my scope in, mostly on published papers, and we'll go with that. I am not going to give you a whole bunch of meta-analyses. There's lots of these that have been done. So you can see in the last 5 or 6 years, these are just some of them. There's probably a couple more since I even made this one. But so I'll leave this here for you. If anybody wants the references, I'm glad to provide them. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is to talk to you about some things that I think are important and touch on several of these, but just give you minor amounts and if minor amounts of information. And if you have further questions, you can ask me either here today or outside by sending me email. I think it's always important to start with rumen health of the cow. Probably a bunch of you learned some kind of acidosis spiral like this, like I did. You start off by adding more corn, and next thing you know, you have the pH goes way down, strep bovis really takes over in the bottom left, and then, wow, even you can have a dead cow. That red circle is where we shouldn't really be having acute acidosis. If you do, then somebody's doing something wrong. But I wanted to start there. There's lots of additives that are involved that sort of indirectly improve lactate utilization. I want to make the point here that it's not lactate production that's the problem. It's when it accumulates because it's not being used. And then sort of a hidden one is succinate. There's probably more of that that's being produced than we know because hardly anybody measures it. And it's really important that both of these be used because they really have specific roles in helping key fiber degrading bacteria to break down fiber, which of course is our goal. So Fibrobacter succinogenes, for example, it gets its name because it likes to make succinate. But it wouldn't be able to keep doing it unless somebody else was using itself to culture. But there's probably lots of other microbes that do this, for example, Prevotella. Then there's also some important lactolytics. That means they use lactate. Selenomonas has been widely studied, including by one of Todd's former mentors, on how does it actually work for this. And so when you use lactate, you're helping to decrease its concentration. It's about 10 times stronger of an acid than the VFA, so it helps to maintain pH just by keeping lactate low. And so the low pH is just one of the potential ways to improve fiber degradability by Ruminococcus, Fibrobacter, and other fibrolytic microbes. I didn't mention Megasphaera on the previous slide. This is one that's also been implicated in these. I'm including it here alone because it's a potential probiotic for you to consider. It also is a key lactate user. It is anaerobic if you're going to dose it, so you need to follow the directions to be able to maintain its viability and hopefully help it to establish in the rumen of the animals that you inoculated. It's really important that lactate be used, but I want to remind you that when propionate or including a higher chain volatile fatty acid is made, that means really more energy for the animal. And it's not just more energy, but especially butyrate and valerate, that's 4 carbons and 5 carbons, are really important for fuel for the rumen epithelium, but also as transcription factors to help maintain an appropriate barrier. So some of these microbes that are helping, like Megasphaera, helping to increase these VFA, that's actually good for rumen health. There's some potential, I think, most likely for this additive, especially when animals are going into transition. So like a cow that's dry, that's moving into the transition period as you're sort of rapidly increasing concentrate in the diet. Probably those that have higher potential intake and milk production, even more responsive. There's been some discussion, does Megasphaera actually increase trans-10 cis-12 CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, which has been implicated in milk fat depression? I personally don't think the evidence is that strong. I think it's more likely to be associated with conditions. So an increase in Megasphaera are the same conditions when there's an increase in the trans-10 shift, so-called, that's related to milk fat depression. So I think it's a potential probiotic in those situations for you to consider. Paul Weimer and his colleague there put together this review on Megasphaera that's really extensive. And as I mentioned, it takes up lactate, not just making propionate that's in the blue circle, but also the higher chain carbon numbers 4, 5, and 6 in there. It's not as high abundance in dairy compared with beef feedlot situations, but they make the case that if you actually look at the transcripts of it, that is the mRNA associated with this Megasphaera elsdennii, then it might be more transcriptionally active than its abundance would show. They make the point that the efficacy of dosing to get a response in it probably depends on the conditions of the animal. So even though it's kind of helping to prevent SARA, I don't think you want to dose it into situations where you're already having it. It's probably not going to fix that. So really high starch, low physically effective NDF. One potential advantage for this one is if you're using Monensin, it's kind of Monensin insensitive. And so in that case, it might be better able to have a take hold situation. There's been, when I looked into this a few years ago, surprising amount of research done looking at combining a lactate producer, intentionally making lactate, just combining it with another sort of co-probiotic that is using it as a sort of a 1-2 punch to try to get more propionate or butyrate. And so sometimes you see some responses that look promising. So here's a couple of papers on this in my review. You can see them if you're interested. They are in the situations where there haven't been as much of a response, probably starch was just too high in those diets. It could be maybe just because they didn't work, but I think it's more likely that, when you have such high starch, a propionate can go up, and you're more likely to then increase propionate from this one that might actually then decrease intake even more. So you're sort of accumulating more propionate beyond what you might want. This is kind of different compared with when people add sugars, which I won't talk about today. They generally increase butyrate and valerate, not propionate. Some mixed results in the hindgut of lactating cows, which is an intriguing possibility, and some of them might actually be targeted for the hindgut. That might be actually pretty useful because several researchers have shown that when you start having high concentrate diets, the hindgut is maybe prone to having issues than the rumen. The rumen has 4 layers of cells and is kind of more resistant to some of the low pH kind of things. So some potential there. In particular for dairy calves, I'm not really talking about them today, but when they're prone to having scours and so on, some of these probiotics might have some potential role there. So I haven't seen a lot on this. You just need to make sure that if you're considering it, that if they're going to be effective in the hindgut, they have to get past the bile that's normally secreted there, because some microbes are inhibited by compounds in bile. And even so, there's lots and lots of studies with humans that have shown effective probiotics, including these combinations. So I would suspect that there's a potential for this to work in this case. You almost can't talk about additives without talking about Monensin, kind of the key one. It's been around for a long time, still very effective. It's generally attributed to increasing propionate. Sometimes you don't see as much of a response in dairy with increased propionate as you do with beef feedlot cattle, but you're kind of using more of a similar dose, whereas beef cattle usually have a lower feed intake. So you're kind of concentrating the dose on a sort of percentage basis. So propionate is certainly part of the response, but I think it's not the only one. An intriguing factor for me is that not just propionate per se, but when you feed Monensin, it could be sort of improving feed efficiency by shifting the feeding behavior of animals a little bit. So they eat more meals of a little bit less per meal. So that could be a benefit in the rumen. But clearly, overall, you see a more stable rumen, less risk for SARA, and so on. I'd like to bring this up because I don't think there's very much risk for resistance genes. Obviously, Todd is an expert on this from when he's studied this, and maybe he can answer those questions better than me. But I really think, from the human safety standpoint, there's no risk. We need to just keep using this one. You want to be careful to include it with really high starch, really low effective fiber, especially if there's a lot of unsaturated fat. When Monensin became legal to be used with dairy cattle, there were some issues of milk fat depression. From my understanding, most of that has been cleaned up, and we don't see these kind of issues anymore. But I just want to make sure you're aware of that. Yeast is another really staple that people have used. I think that over time there's been a lot of information coming together on yeast and yeast extract that really makes it a very useful additive to help stabilize the rumen. Probably it helps to yeast kind of get attracted to the forage particle there that you can see where really all the fibrolytic microbes are, helps to consume oxygen. They have enzymes that are inhibited by even trace amounts of oxygen. So that's really good for them. Probably helps them to colonize and break down the fiber particles faster before they get pushed out of the rumen through passage. But there's some potential that there's some malate that's being produced that helps to stimulate lactate production that I was kind of talking about in the beginning. So a lot more information on that than I have time to talk about today. Some potential other compounds in yeast or yeast extract that supports the microbes, including amino acids or peptides. So kind of a staple there and something to really strongly consider. You tend to see a couple of pounds per day in energy corrected milk. Maybe you might see a little more under the right circumstances, but based on the cost, it's usually very cost effective to do that. I think you'll see even more response than this average if you're adding yeast to a situation where it can improve fiber digestibility. Many studies have shown that when they've looked at the abundance of key cellulitic bacteria, that yeast tends to increase their abundance. Not always, but typically will result in an improvement in fiber digestibility. Again, the key way that has been described to help them is by making sure lactate doesn't accumulate and by quenching oxygen. But you also kind of see a tendency for feed intake to be a little bit improved. And there's 3 or 4 studies that have again shown a more appropriate feed intake behavior pattern. So maybe an extra meal per day for a cow with a little bit less per meal, that helps to make sure that conditions are more consistent in the rumen for fiber degradation. Some really interesting work, I think, on yeast or yeast extract, improving epithelium of the rumen, the integrity of it. And I think that's there's plenty of information on that really makes me think that's another added boost to these kind of products. So helping the animal to be able to transition through an increase in concentrate in the diet is a good way for yeast to help pay for themselves. There's been a lot of research on so-called hydrogen or electron acceptors. These are these ones shown here. Like, you can add nitrate. I don't think people are doing sulfate too much anymore, but nitrate is being looked at over and over. It's kind of making a renewal in the research field, and people are adding malate or fumarate. You can see at the bottom of the slide there that fumarate is converted to succinate and therefore to propionate. And in so doing, it's actually then taking up H2, which could otherwise really be diverted. It's therefore being diverted away from the methanogens to make methane at the top of the screen. So that's really the key goal. So if someone is adding some kind of inhibitor to decrease methane, nitrate could be a second addition to that. Probably not when you add 3-NOP, but any other way, like seaweed and things like that. A little bit of nitrate could be helpful to serve as an alternate electron or H2 acceptor. So we're starting to see now sort of a second wave of studies adding these kind of compounds in addition to other methane inhibitors. More research coming down the pipeline there that I think might help us to be able to feed a little less of these alternates and therefore help them to be more useful. The reason is because when you're inhibiting methane, the aqueous hydrogen concentration goes up, and you can see in the bottom half of this slide the Km for usage of hydrogen is higher. So when when hydrogen concentration more matches the Km, these bottom ones have more of an opportunity to be able to reduce nitrate or convert fumarate into succinate and therefore take up H2. This has been shown by Emilio Ungerfeld in a model that's on the right-hand side, that if you get a spike of aqueous hydrogen, which is shown on the left graph, if it goes up, then that's the same thing as moving to the right on the bottom, on the bottom axis of the right panel. You can see how then methanogenesis really decreases relative to the ability of these microbes to make succinate, or some of them could be to use nitrate or nitrite. So again, that's kind of the 1-2 punch that people are looking at right now. Something that really caught my attention as we're doing research right now on biochar. It's a very interesting compound. It has a lot of iron in it. So in the left panel, you can see that there are some microbes that can actually sink electrons to iron. And so the electrons can be passing outside of their cell, sort of like grounding electricity, and therefore helping to decrease hydrogen production in the first place. The middle panel shows quinone in the cell wall of bacteria being able to use as an electron shuttle to be able to allow electrons to move outside of the cell and be collected by a graphite electrode. This is being looked at more and more, and probably what biochar is doing is helping to facilitate that. So biochar and nitrate were discussed in a pretty good review by Leng in this paper here, but never together. And I think that's maybe what we're looking at in our current research right now. What if we provide them together? What we saw Anna Kolganova's work is that you can see in the left panel that methane goes down when you add biochar alone, but especially when you add it with nitrate. And you can see the very far right bar was with only 1% biochar and 1% nitrate was the most effective. Interestingly, if you look on the right panel, you see biochar decreased hydrogen emission, which is the goal that we're all trying to figure out, how to decrease emission when methane gets inhibited. When you add nitrate, it goes up, so the middle bar went way up, but as you move to the right and again add nitrate with biochar, it helps to prevent that. So some really exciting research there. As we look more, you can see into this, there's some potential for quinones to still be available in biochar, or it could be the iron. So like you see in the very bottom one, of course, you don't want Klebsiella because it's a bad bacterium, but what we saw is another uncultured Enterobacterales genus that went up when we added nitrate. So it's not just Selenomonas or Megasphaera reducing the nitrate. It could be some other ones like this. But even more interesting, you can see in the very far right one that when we added nitrate with biochar, or really its nitrate effect, then you increase the relative abundance of this family, Succinivibrio. That's the one that a lot of people have emphasized in low methane emitting animals. There's usually a high abundance of those because they probably are using hydrogen to be able to sink it into other compounds and therefore keeping it away from methane. Biochar is very variable, and so I've been asked a lot about this. You need to be careful that what source you get is it depends. Make sure you get a reputable source. A lot of interest in native microbes. You collect some microbes from the cow rumen instead of from a lab culture, and they're more likely to take hold. You can see in this publication from University of Florida that energy-corrected milk went up, and efficiency went up, and also milk fatty acids that are probably more. You can see the CLA cis9 trans 11. That's more indicative of biohydrogenation not being completed quite as much. But even so, it's the right kind of CLA that we want that doesn't depress milk fat. Even though the one on the bottom, the trans 10 one, went up a little bit, the CLA 9 one went up more and is way more abundant. So something really interesting there. They followed this up by looking at microbiome analysis, and these products both decrease the relative abundance of Succinivibrio, which I just talked about. So I think probably some more research if you're going to look at this as in combination with ways to suppress methane. Maybe some different native microbials, but I understand there's a succinylvibrio in the pipeline to be looked at, so it could be added back and then help to prevent against that. Methane, I know I'm running short of my time here. It's hard to interrupt methane production without causing other issues. So for all these reasons, we need to be careful we don't disrupt the rumen. One way that I want to point out in the last bit of my time here is that people have looked at inhibiting protozoa. And you can see then as protozoa cells on the bottom axis go down, methane goes way down. So I've just highlighted a log of 5 and a log of 7. And going down that much decreases methane per unit of intake, this huge amount from 25 to 10. That looks really great on its own, but when you inspect the data further, what you see is also happening at the same time as a suppression of fiber digestibility and a suppression of intake. And for this reason, I think we need to be much more nuanced in how we study the protozoa. So this paper that just came out in the journal Science shows that the isotrichids, which you can see a picture on the right side, they have cilia around their entire cell. But they also have these so-called hydrogenal bodies, which are producing H2 hydrogen all around their cell, whereas the other major group has cilia only around their mouth. And what you can see, the hydrogenal bodies in very faint red there are only by the mouth. So the ones that are way more important in producing hydrogen that's obviously being used for methane are these isotrichids. And so for a bunch of reasons, every time people have tried to suppress protozoa, you get some sort of potential negative issue that pops up. And that's why protozoal suppression wasn't emphasized in the Christoph paper down there in the middle of it. If you're going to do it, you just got to be really careful because other microbes take their place. And in the end, only really those isotrichids are the ones that are really primarily responsible for the excess methane. Almost nobody's tried to distinguish those, and we need more work on that. So just a few more slides here. I want to emphasize that 3-NOP works great for methanogenesis, generally pretty persistent. More and more research being done on that. The big question is, how can we prevent this sort of increase in hydrogen emission by diverting more hydrogen towards these, in the very bottom of my slide, C3 to C6, that is propionate to caproate VFA. How can we capture more of those? Some really interesting being done right now in that, and I think there's a lot of potential in the future. And then the very last thing I just have to mention, I talked about plant compounds in the review. I'll leave you to the review if you're interested in that. I just want to make the bottom point here that we can be looking at multiple ones of these at the same time, which I think is probably the future for a lot of these plant components. And then the very last one I want to mention is branch chain BFA. This was studied back in the 1980s. The ISO Plus product came out. Lots of work on that, and now more and more research being done. I've reviewed this in a paper, and I just want to emphasize that in this paper, you tend to see an improvement in fiber digestibility, 3 to 5%. If that's the case, you will either see an improvement in milk production or kind of like Rumensin. Sometimes you don't see an improvement in milk, but you might see a bit of a decrease in dry matter intake if those animals were in later lactation and therefore they got more energy, so they just ate less. So an improvement in feed efficiency. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Remember, additives can't replace good management. You still need to be able to feed cows with correct diets. If you're going to look at additives, make sure you try to understand the mode of action and look for consistency responses when you're evaluating vendors. Thank you, and I'll end here.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. That was fantastic. It was a great overview of everything, and I think you did a great job in covering a lot of material. So we've got our first question out of the audience is what do you consider the most important factor a nutritionist should consider before they choose or add in a rumen modifier?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of making sure the diet is right from the carbohydrate standpoint, first of all, that you don't add so much extra starch, for example, that these modifiers aren't going to work very well, except maybe a buffer. And make sure the forage particle size is correct so that you have a proper effective fiber. Once you've done that, a lot of additives can be very useful, but they're never, I don't think they're going to take the place of that. So I want to see that, and I would want to see a mode of action, and I would want to see some peer-reviewed data on this.
Okay, that's very good. So if you had to pick one of these things to use, you've got enough funding for one of these modifiers. Which one do you trust? Do you think gives you the biggest bang for your buck?
Well, I wouldn't make a diet without Monensin unless I had to because of how I market in the milk. So that one is sort of a clear one. I think yeast are pretty consistent, not a relatively small response, but relatively cheap to add. So I didn't have much time to say the branch chain BFA probably are effective if you have our room integrated protein in the right way. So I understand that there's some potential positive responses that way. I guess I'll stop there instead of keep answering that one.
Okay, well, that sounds great. And we really appreciate your time, Jeff. And as always, it's a great pleasure to talk to you and listen to your thoughts. So thank you very much, bud.
And thank you, Todd. And if people want to send me an email, I'm glad to try to answer your question after this. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. So before we take a break, we're going to have our next presenter, who is Maggie Faulkner from Agriplastics. And today she's going to tell us about early life development of the future dairy cow. So, Maggie, welcome. Please, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you. It's going to be not as exciting as Dr. Jeff's was. So apologize. Hard to go after someone like that, though, and especially when you haven't talked for 10 years. So please allow me a little bit of grace here. I haven't done a presentation in a long time. So today, we're just going to talk a little bit about the early development of the future dairy cow and how nutrition, environment, stress, feeding behavior, and management all interact much earlier than we sometimes appreciate. So when we look at calves, we sometimes think about them as a separate phase of production. But really, we're developing our future herd. And so immune development is happening, rumen development is happening, feeding behaviors are developing, stress adaptation is developing, and those early life experiences may influence how the future cow performs later on. So the question kind of becomes, are we raising calves, or are we intentionally developing future dairy cows as early as we can? A lot of times I feel like we run into scenarios where we're talking about them after they're weaned, and more so when they're in that early stages of trying to get them bred for the first time, or right before the breeding, or even just transition after weaning. So I'm going to take a look at a little bit more of that earlier side of things. So research is pointing at the earlier side of things. So the research on this continues to evolve, but the signal's becoming really hard to ignore. So a 2016 meta-analysis published in the journal Dairy Science found positive associations between pre-weaning average daily gain and first lactation milk production. There was also a meta-analysis later in 2025 5 that was also showed same associations, similar associations as well between early life growth and future performance. So now, obviously, this relationship is complex and there's a lot of variables that are involved, but those meta-analyses were pretty intriguing to look at. And we continue to see evidence suggesting that early life nutrition, stress, disease pressure, and growth consistency may influence long-term outcomes of that dairy cow. So I think it's changing how many of us are thinking or starting to really think about calf development, especially when you consider the price of calves right now as well. So it becomes especially interesting because it's not just about future milk production. It's the possibility that early life development may influence how calves respond, especially to nutritional strategies later in life. There was one meta-analysis, or there was one fact data from that, and it showed, I'm having trouble seeing it on my screen, but there's 300 kilograms more first lactation milk yields per additional 100 grams a day of pre-weaning weight. I found that one really intriguing and have been doing a little bit more looking at some of these types of studies and looking a little bit further ahead. Hope to give you guys a little bit more data to present, but it wasn't quite ready. So the calf experiences everything simultaneously, and we're not always necessarily thinking about that. The one thing that I think that's really important is they're just not experiencing these systems independently. They're experiencing nutrition, environment, stress, health, transitions, management, all at once. That first 60 days is really intense on that calf's life. And every management decision influences multiple biological systems simultaneously. So when we look at calf performance, it's rarely one isolated variable. It's usually a cumulative biological experience of the calf that we need to be thinking about. That's also what's important in those meta-analysis. There's obviously different variables you can't look at. So that's something to be aware of as well. As we know, stress is cumulative, and stress stacking becomes really important. Small stressors compound biologically over time. So poor ventilation by itself might not seem catastrophic, but heat stress might not seem completely catastrophic, especially if you're, controlling it, but a rough transition as well. So calves often are experiencing those things all at one time, which will add to the disease pressure as well. So we have to think about how we're weaning these calves. What disease pressure do they have? What's going on with the herd, and all those kinds of things. And those are energy that could potentially otherwise support growth, immune function, and development. So biologically, stress responses require metabolic resources, and repeated stress exposure redirects energy toward adaptation and recovery rather than growth. So we know that the multiple studies that pre-weaning disease events have been associated with reduced future milk production. I think this is like one of the biggest mind shifts in calf management, and there are definitely all areas of the spectrum here. I would say we have shifted away from the did the calf survive mentality, and we're looking at did the calf thrive a little bit more, especially as technologies have come on board. I'm excited to hear later from one of our technology companies is presenting. I think she'll have some great additives to that, and we've seen improvements there. But so we really need to be thinking about, okay, we're not just trying to get this calf to survive because of the price of it. We're wanting her to thrive because it's going to give her, we're going to have more choices to choose from for our future herd when we have multiple calves to bring in as our replacements. So and they're just not the same thing. So we need to be thinking about them differently. A calf can survive while it's still experiencing chronic stress, inconsistent intake, and environmental pressure, but are we building or developing a resistant calf that can take pressure, that's going to handle transitions well in multiple ways? So one of the things, and it's a high debate I often run into, and I've been really digging into a lot more of the research on this, and this is what I was hoping to present a little bit more on today, but unfortunately, the data just wasn't quite ready. So feeding methods really do influence development, and we're seeing that more, and it's more than just nutrient delivery. So the way a calf consumes milk influences feeding behavior, intake patterns, hydration behavior, and transition periods. Research continues evaluating how feeding behavior influences the intake patterns, the starter acceptance, and the transition development. And I think feeding method deserves to be part of the developmental conversation, not just the labor conversation. So this doesn't mean that one system is going to work perfectly for every farm, but milk feeding behavior may influence how calves accept starter, how rumen development progresses, and how smoothly calves transition through weaning. I've seen some pretty exciting stuff happening on some farms with, looking at, okay, there's the old adage of teat versus bucket feeding, but it goes down to more than that. Like, what's their ingestion speed? Are they suckling slowly? Are they drinking slowly? This is going to have this physiological triggers in that. So when you are suckling, it enhances saliva, which triggers various enzymes, which can act as a buffer. Saliva has a lot of really great things in it also to boost immunity that we often overlook. So I know, especially on some of our, calf ranches and things like that. So we want to get it done. Time is money, especially on those places, and even on every farm, time is money. So we want to hurry up and get the chores done, the calves fed, and move on to the next thing. There's a million things to do. But when we do slow down that feeding, especially the milk feedings, we are seeing more interactions to create opportunities for observation for caregivers. So, that calf, it wasn't just that calf didn't drink their milk or it didn't come up right away. It was, various small things that we're not noticing. Technology is helping with that as well. But also want to point out weaning transition. So milk feeding behavior influences starter acceptance, which then in turn helps rumen development and weaning success. So really important data here that I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about more at further dates and dig in a little bit more with some of that stuff. There's some exciting things happening in this area. So water, essential. We all know it. Water drives rumen development. One thing we clearly know is that water intake matters for a lot of various factors, but especially in that rumen development. The milk bypasses the rumen through the esophageal groove, and researchers like, I'm gonna hack their name, but Van Ambrew, Drackley, and Heinrichs have all contributed significantly to understanding the calf nutrition and rumen development really early in that life period. Free water and starter intake become critical for rumen fermentation and development. And sometimes we just underestimate how important hydration, timing, and starter behavior are during this transition period. So make sure the calf always has water. I do not like it when I'm going to a farm and we're not, and there's buckets are not as full as they should be, or are near empty and occasionally empty. So if when we're going on farms, that's one thing we really want to make sure we're also looking at as a key factor. It's really just affect. I think it froze there for a second. But environment also shapes the biology. So it's often sometimes underestimated. And we have different housing setups that are all available now. But the environment we measure is not always the environment the calf experiences. And that's something we need to point out often. You know, even just this, you see this calf laying down here and the vents behind it, those were not industry standard 10, 15 years ago. There wasn't as much ventilation in the outdoor housing situations that they had now. This came from a development of getting down there, being in with the calf and noticing that it's really hot. How can I drill holes? The calf's not sitting up here. They're down here when they're laying down and getting their rest. So how are the calves getting that right ventilation at their level? And are we measuring it there? Airflow, humidity, bedding conditions, solar load, all of those things occur at the calf level. So environmental stressors like ventilation, humidity, thermal stress all contribute to the calf's biological stress load, and small environmental pressures can be meaningful biological stressors over time. So the question is, and this kind of is where I'm hoping this all connects together a little bit for everyone, but before we continue adding more technologies, interventions, management strategies, supplements, we have to ask, are we fully utilizing the calf foundation first? So is the calf comfortable? Is the starter intake strong? Are we doing transitions gradually enough? You know, especially with the milk. Are we doing slow weans on the milk? Are we gradually stepping those calves down on the milk before we go into, you know, put them into a group situation? Or are we holding them back from, are we weaning them off of milk and holding them back for a week before we put them into another stressful situation of a group pen when they've been in individual pen as well? So, and is ventilation functioning properly at the calf level? And because we're asking, you know, we're asking nutrition and feed technologies to optimize their performance in the cows later in life, we have to consider how well the calf's digestive, rumen, and metabolic systems were developed early on. So the question becomes, are we using nutritional strategies to build on a strong foundation? Or are we sometimes asking them to compensate for developmental challenges that could have been reduced earlier? The stronger the biological foundation is, the better position the calf may be to respond to nutritional tools later. So mine was short and sweet, kind of that speech of back to normal, but I think the biggest takeaway is that the future dairy cow is built much earlier than we sometimes appreciate. Nutrition, stress, environment, feeding behavior, and management are not separate systems. They are one. And together they're going to shape the biological resilience of the future dairy cow. And ultimately, thousands of small interactions compound over time into the animal that eventually enters the milking herd. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Maggie. So our first question is, in your experience, what's the biggest mistake that producers make when it comes to feeding management in those first critical weeks of a calf's life, and what advice do you have to fix it?
Yeah, it would depend. It varies a lot on farm. So it would depend on the person's individual management practices. But one thing that I feel like we're constantly having conversations with on farm or seeing on farm is not giving starter feed maybe early enough, as well as not looking at how we're feeding the calf. A lot of times we want to feed them too fast. We're looking at how we can get that milk in and get those chores done. And there's a lot to be said. There's a lot more studies that need to be done, especially in that area of what does it do if we're feeding them too fast. Ruminal drinking is a big issue, but are we closing the esophageal groove properly by feeding with a bucket? There's evidence that supports that it does. There's evidence that suggests that we're not. So how are we getting that? Are we pushing them, and is that hindering rumen development and growth? So that when we're in a transition period, we're seeing faults because the rumen's not fully developed. Those are kind of questions that we're starting to look at, and people are asking on the dairy farms that we're talking about as well. Did that answer that question?
Yeah, I think it does. And it brings up the next question that they have is there a critical window in that early calf development where that environment is going to make the biggest difference? And what should producers be focusing on during that time?
It would depend on the season, where your location, the farm location, and all those variables are at as well. But critical windows, the first few weeks is the first 2 to 3 weeks is going to be really big. That 60-day period as well. And what's really making the biggest difference? Patience. It's just something we all struggle with, but really just patience and giving, are we doing, do we have clean bedding? Are the calves comfortable? What are the calves showing us? Are we observing the calves? Are we spending time to observe them? As if you do spend that time, you will start to see things, and you will start to notice things. So spending a little extra time with them and not rushing. If you can have a staggered program on your ranch where maybe the first 2 weeks, or your farm, the first 2 weeks, you are paying a little bit more attention to those calves early on in that period.
Okay. And you bring up a very valuable point about that labor on a farm of, it's a finite resource. You're trying to get it done, but that works against you on getting your calves up on their feet, and you're kind of walking a balance between prepping that rumen and getting that calf growing, and those are somewhat conflictive drives that they have. So it's really hard to do that and still maintain enough people doing things on a farm. So it's really challenging.
It's exceptionally challenging, and that doesn't fall on deaf ears to me. I have been out there doing chores and understand the finite resources and the time that does go on a dairy farm. That is where technology does come in to help as well, and we're seeing those benefits. But sometimes what a lot of times when people think they are going to get robotic, when milking robotics came around, people are like, I'm going to have so much more free time. Actually, you don't end up having more free time. You just end up doing things differently. You're now not milking cows at a certain time of day. You're doing all the other things that needed to be done. Does it help with resources? Yes, but you kind of have to think of it that way as well. So what am I, can I spend more time here so I don't have to do something else in the back end is really where you kind of need to think about that.
Yeah, and your point about stresses along the whole continuum are really good. And that's been something that we've all argued about. What are these real stresses that these animals face, and how do we deal with them? So your presentation was really good on bringing up those points and driving those home.
Thank you.
So, since we don't have any more questions out of the audience, this is the perfect time for us to have our 10-minute break. So, thank you very much, Maggie. And please take the opportunity, everybody, to go stretch your legs, go to the restroom, grab some water or a cup of coffee. But before we go, I still want to thank our sponsors: Agrarian Solutions, Agriplastics, Cow Manager, DietForge.ai, InBarn, Priority IAC, and Ranging Group. So we will see you guys in a few minutes. Thank y'all.
like the street lights lit this town, like a fire in a blaze, gotta burn it down. Can't be afraid to leave this out. We got this far, don't know how. I see danger in your eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we gonna let it away. Tonight, we gonna let it away. Tonight, we gonna let it away. Just like the sunrise, we gonna let it away. Just like a spark that's breaking out. Can't make a stop, can't turn back now. We know that there's no room for doubt. No, we can't turn back now. I see danger in your eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we gonna light it up. Tonight, we gonna let it away. Tonight, we gonna let it up. Just like the sunrise, we gonna let it up.
Todd, your mic is off. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that, y'all. So, hi, everybody. Welcome and welcome back. So, if you're just joining us, I'm Todd Calloway, and I'm your host this afternoon. And I hope you took a chance during that break to recharge and get some caffeine in you. And that way you can get ready to go again. So, we're going to continue with our presentations and move on to our next speaker. So please remember at the end of each presentation that we've got a Q&A section. So feel free to post any of the questions you may have on the chat. So if it comes up while they're talking, go ahead and put it in the chat and be ready for it. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Lori Nagel from Cow Manager to talk about healthy starts, strong futures, the data-powered calf care. So thank you, Dr. Nagel. Welcome.
Thank you. It's exciting to follow some great speakers such as Dr. Firkins and Maggie, and I think my information ties in well. All right. Thank you for the opportunity to share what's happening with our Cow Manager system and its role in growing great calves for our dairy industry. I wanted to just give a little background information on our company. Cow Manager is really a dynamic, growing company with a global reach in over 45 countries. We're also a family-owned company that started by a dairy family and maintains the research farm as an area to look at different opportunities for our system. So we work together throughout the world with dairies and their advisors and their management teams to better animal welfare and health. We try to provide solutions to the biggest challenges that the dairy producers bring to us. Often we're able to help them with adding health and longevity to their cow herd. We're able to provide some cost-effective solutions that they're able to integrate into their systems, and we're really able to help with their labor, sometimes providing new opportunities for training, learning new systems, doing things different. Sometimes the labor is reallocated as we move forward. Not always a labor savings, but as we know, oftentimes as technology changes, we and the labor on the dairy are doing things differently, and those can be some of the best solutions that we bring. Cow Manager is now able to provide a lifetime monitoring solution system. So we're able to start monitoring on the calves. It's called our young stock module. And we're able to carry that through all phases of the life of the cow as she enters the herd, as she goes through lactations and dry periods. We have our young stock monitoring system, which includes health and fertility as they age. Then we on our mature animals, we can be monitoring health, fertility. We also have specific transition modules that help us regulate and monitor what's happening during that very critical dry period. And we're really trying to help the producers get those cows off to a great start at that next lactation. And then we have a nutrition module, which really gives us the ability to do a lot of comparisons of the behaviors that are happening, oftentimes relative to nutritional or even environmental changes. You'll notice our system is depicted in this calf. This calf's picture was taken in a little different weather from today. It's wearing a calf jacket, often needed in our upper Midwest climates in the winter. But that orange tag in its left ear is our Cow Manager sensor tag. So that is applied in a calf as young as 3 to 5 days, and can be at 2 weeks, depending on what the herd chooses. And from there, we have our monitoring health system set up for that animal. That same tag can stay in the animal throughout its life. It has an 8 to 10-year battery life, so we don't have to do further adjustments, and it's able to just stick with it along the way. So our goal is to really give that calf a strong foundation. Just exactly as Maggie spoke about earlier, we realize that strong foundation is what gives us a cow that's able to have more longevity. Studies have shown have increased milk yield. And so we know that by combining that with being able to utilize the genetic potential that these herds are so trying to develop, that we can really help develop a solid dairy herd basis. So we are providing alerts for the calves, alerts for sick calves in particular. So picking up and providing disease surveillance is very important. This really allows our calf team managers to have early intervention. And we know that getting to those animals earlier provides better treatment success and an earlier return to normal function. We can also use our monitoring and data to help provide some feedback on overall calf development and provide some summaries on what's happening during the weaning period, which can be very important. And once again, just a reminder, as in this calf in the lower right, that sensor is the same sensor that can stay all the way from the calf through the heifer and into the cow period. All right, so just to explain a little bit about how our system works, a little bit on its functionality. As we first log in, as the users log in on the dairy, excuse me, we are able to see a dashboard which summarizes all aspects of the dairy. So this herd that's being depicted is a herd that uses the monitoring system on their calves and their cows. However, that's not a requirement. We can do monitoring of only the calves if that's what's desired. So on this general dashboard screen, we see fertility overviews. We can be looking at summaries of what's happening on that cow side and making sure reproduction is moving along. We also have our transition alerts, which are helping us monitor those dry cows and giving some extra insight into what's happening, what attention they may need. Another area that we do have a focus on across the spectrum of ages are group alerts, which are changes across a percentage of a group or a pen that could be a signal that things are different. There's some different behaviors going on. And so we have group alerts on heat, low feed intake, as well as health changes within a group. So we also have a quick look in the upper right corner on how our sensors are working. So a real quick view can show us if any adjustments need to be made and help us to know for that team if there's some maintenance that may need to be done. Now on the calves, we're going to focus right in that front and center on those health alerts. And we have the sick calf alert listed that I have circled in blue. And so from there, it's going to give a quick look for the calf care team, how many animals are on the healthcare list to look at today. Okay, so they have a quick idea of the number, and by clicking right there on the sick calf area, it will lead them quickly to a list of the calves that have what's called a health alert, where we've noticed that there's changes from our algorithm notes changes than the days prior or against the activities of other herd mates in this behavior. So at that point, we'll have a list of animals and it'll tell the amount of time that they've had an alert or the amount of time that the behavior has noticed a change. And we'll also have those put into categories of suspicious, sick, and very sick. So if necessary, it can also be used to prioritize which animals are looked at first. This list can be sorted and altered in many ways, so we can customize this as the dairy would like. And once again, we have a list in hand, per se, that whoever champions this or who's ever the lead on this at the farm now literally has a list to hand off to someone else and say, this is our goal, that we need to get these calves looked at and determine what needs to be done. So that can be done. This list is printable. This list can be downloaded to Excel. The list can be seen here on the PC and also on our app on phone or other device. So whatever works for the dairy, we have dairies that do a variety of different situations to go out and look and recognize these animals. All right, so we have our calf list, And of course, we've said that now Cow Manager, our sensors, have noticed there's a behavior change. And we work with our herds to encourage that they develop a plan of what to do next. We say we have a checklist really that helps us remember the different areas of the calf to look at, to examine, and to check. So the example here has some of the basics that we're always looking for in calves. We're always looking, is there a temperature? Looking for diarrhea, pneumonia, and or a naval infection. So we have those out there as a basic checklist, but of course, this can and really should be monitored, modified with the herd veterinarian to determine what's the best plan for this dairy and what would be some of the best steps moving forward. So we've accomplished that hopefully by saying we've got a signal, we've got an action, and now we have a specialized person on the calf care team ready to go out and examine that animal and go from there. So we have a list and we sort of know our tasks for the day, but sometimes we can dig a little deeper if we want to look at more of the history of what's been happening with that calf, or we want to really get an idea of how does that calf's activity look versus others in the group. So we have two main graphs that are also accessible just by a click of a button as we look at that individual animal. And the one on the left, I apologize. I hope it's you're able to see, but really just looking at the color patterns, we have our blue and our green are rumination and eating. So together we call that in calves really consumption. So measuring all those times of intake. And the other big area we're looking at there is that yellow area. And the yellow area is inactivity. So we see that calf at the left has a lot more time being inactive than what we would expect. And because of that, we have a health alert that's come up, which is signaled here by an extra red box with the white cross. So we can look back and look at what has been happening with the animal. We can see if this has happened very quickly or very acutely, or if this has been happening for quite some time. So the graph on the right is also a valuable one to look at in certain situations. And this is a specific graph called the calf development graph that is really tracked for each animal and becomes part of their cow card. For the first 6 months, it tracks all of the daily activities and summarizes them. And we usually choose to have these summarize two areas. On this graph on the right, the yellow area, the yellow shaded area, is one standard deviation in the activity of, the inactivity of the herd. Okay. The line in the middle is the average. So we know that inherently calves start out on the left of the graph at day 0, and they're very inactive. They're very quiet, very stoic. And they start to be more active and more rambunctious just naturally as they go on in age. So we expect that line to be going down. On the brown area is a combination of both eating and ruminating. So it's a sum of all of the intake that the calf has had. And that too is being monitored with the average, the dotted line across the middle, and the shaded area showing one standard deviation or the majority of the calves. And this is data that has been built, and our algorithm builds this around the specific herd. So it gets a read on what are the normal activities within the herd, what are the recent activities of the herd, and it plots that out against the day of age. So each calf then has its consumption plotted in the brown area and its inactivity plotted in the yellow. And so we can follow those trends as we move along, and those can also be a very handy way to look how the animal is doing in this reference against other animals of the same age within this herd. And so this can be very useful as we start to use that background shaded area to give us some hints on what's happening within this herd and what are the activity and the developmental trends there. So we have these two formats that are displayed. This is always part of their information, and we do store our data really all the data back to the point that the sensor has been placed. All right, as we talk about really being able to intervene early, it's very important that we are able to understand that Cow Manager can recognize an illness on average about 3 days earlier than clinical signs are noted. So this was done in many, through studies in many herds across both the US and Europe. And so we were able to then look at, once we see the alert, and help the dairies make a plan on who's going to examine, how are we going to get a diagnosis, and then we're going to be able to monitor recovery, especially using these behavior or developmental graphs to determine, has the animal recovered, does it need a retreatment, and really have an idea on what's the next best step for that calf. We have some positive testimonials that many herds have shared as they've been interested in sharing the story of how utilizing the Cow Manager in their calves has been beneficial. So we see herds reporting reduced antibiotic use, which is very important, being able to focus on prevention and also having a very focused pathway for treatments. Many of the herds report labor savings, and once again, we really think of that often as a labor redistribution. We know there's other places those labor hours can go toward, but we're trying to still provide the best care for the calves. But we're able to do that a little bit easier by having this basically 24/7 surveillance that reports data back to the system and is being analyzed really every 15 minutes. So we know that can be a real substantial cost savings versus having someone physically walk or review calves on a daily basis. Our herds find this system quite easy to use. For unskilled labor, we have it very easy, as I said, with the different options. We can even do printable lists if we need to, but the app and its use calf side is very popular. So once again, the big advantages are we're producing healthier calves. As Maggie said, we're hoping to have really calves that thrive, have successful calf rearing systems, and really get that high quality genetic animal that there is so much invested into the dairy herds. All right, so I've just spent some time talking about really the front side of the system, and most commonly we think of that as looking at the health alerts and that monitoring side where we're providing feedback on activities in calves that need to be taken care of. But the other aspect that's becoming even more important is to look at what can we gain from understanding in the systems, how good a job are we doing at raising these calves. So we are able to have another calf behavior graph that is developed that summarizes the activities by day of age on the farm. So as we're looking across a herd, they each develop their own pattern. We're hoping, most like the graph that we see on the top, that we're going to have an increasing blue and green area. Once again, that's considered ruminating and eating, or our consumption in the early phases. But as we're building that rumen, we want to see each day's consumption be more than the day before. And so in contrast, we will review herds, and we do find some that have more like the bottom graph, very flat rumen development. And so we can also see areas where there will be dips in the blue and the green or in the consumption. And we can work with the dairies and isolate that down to a specific day or a specific short period of time and work with them on some of the tasks that may be stressing out the calf. So this usually is got enough data that it goes beyond really minor environmental tweaks, but we can easily pick out sometimes where vaccination protocols are affecting the development of the calf, maybe causing some minor setbacks. Dehorning, calf pen moves. All of these things can be areas that we can work and help show the producer what's happening, and if there are maybe some different ways we can approach that and minimize those behavior changes that are seen across the whole herd. All right. As our calves age and continue to grow, once we get past 60 days, we don't continue to maintain that development, 6 months. Once we get past 6 months, we don't continue with the calf development graph and but we do continue our focusing on health. And so we have continual monitoring of the health in the heifers all the way up. And then pretty soon we're getting to that age where we're looking at getting those heifers pregnant, and we start being concerned with reproduction. And so we have our fertility area that comes into play and begins to provide many benefits as we're looking to get those heifers pregnant. So we have some a really easy to read graphs that show when's the ideal insemination window, as cow manager is monitoring activity in the background of these heifers and really starting to get an idea on their expression of estrus. So this can be a real cost savings with less hormones that are needed to be used, as well as no tail chalking. So we can also shift labor here as we get those heifers efficiently bred and on their next step toward being part of our cow herd. As we head into our warmer summer months here in North America, it's a good time to remind ourselves that our cow manager can also, through the tag, do some heat stress monitoring. So this too would give us some alerts. This tends to do group level alerts. So it's working within each of the groups that are set up across the dairy. And that can be down to the pen or the hutch row level in calves. But each of these groups then is analyzed and looking for signs of heat stress, which would be in the graph below, would be higher activity. So that would be in the orange area on the line below. There is usually lower feeding that's a result of heat stress. So our green eating line would tend to decrease. And we would also see a higher surface ear temperature that the sensor is also monitoring, and we would see that increase. So these groups that experience changes in these stressors then would also have a signal, and that is another area that can be tracked. The monitoring signal really is sent as an alert. And once again, we have an aspect that the herd management team can be looking at and seeing what sort of mitigation strategies would they like to employ. As a reminder, I had mentioned earlier, our system is very user-friendly. It can be used across multiple devices. And I also want to remind everyone we have a multi-view system where the dairies can give access to staff, all at selective levels, but we can also invite dairy advisors across the industry that are interested, nutritionists or veterinarians can also look in at this data. So they can look in at the group level data, they can look at the calf health data and be a part of decisions that can be made relative to that information. All right, we always hope to provide some efficiency solutions. So one of the things is that our sensor tag also has a built-in light called a flash. And that flash can be turned on as a means to identify specific animals that need an action. So this can be to identify animals that need some attention because of health. It can be on the fertility side to make sure that we don't miss any of the animals that need to be bred, or we can locate them within a pen to make sure that they're promptly sorted. And we also have a handheld locator that can help us find areas, find the animals within a group and help sort those a little bit faster. So those are some of the solutions that have been able to save quite a bit of time and labor also, as we're really saving that step to get that signal right out by that animal quickly. So I appreciate the opportunity to share our goals with data-powered calf care through our Cow Manager system, and to help share our goals to have a very healthy start as we build a strong future for our calves and their eventual place in our dairy herds. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lori. We've already got a few questions for you. So the first one is, with labor turnover being a reality and a constant on most dairies, what are the day-to-day operational benefits that farms are actually seeing with deploying these sensors? And how easy is it for a new or unskilled staff member to pick it up and use it?
Mhm. We actually have a lot of excitement around using the system. I think many times at work we're all looking for things a little bit new, things a little bit different, and so that is often embraced. I think because we offer our solutions in English and Spanish, I think we've made it very easy for the spectrum of our users to be able to really jump in and utilize it. I do have to say that I think it's important that we have a real champion of the system. We oftentimes do need that consistent person that's there to help create those lists or review those lists, get those lists distributed, and also I think very importantly is to make sure they're there at the end of the day or end of the shift and following up on what's our compliance, how well are these things getting done that we wanted to get done. So it is a very easy to use system, and I do think it brings some enthusiasm to have a different way of doing things on the farms.
Okay. Well, you also mentioned that you guys can use that same sensor on the cow, going all the way from calf all the way to cow producing. So, in your opinion, what's the biggest benefit of having that lifetime data stream on each individual animal?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of benefits. I think number one is the same hardware being able to follow along that animal, and to start back on the calf side and to be a system that doesn't matter if it's on a bottle or on a pail. So it can go through all of the transitions, starting from calf transitions along the way, and it's very flexible, it's very adaptable, and it's really adapting and monitoring each of these new environments and taking that into account. So I really feel like the flexibility of being able to monitor across all those systems. I think the ease of not having to do adjustments like other systems as they grow. We do proper ear tag placement in the calves when we have it a little bit closer to the head, and as they grow just a little bit, it ends up central where we'd like it to be for the adult, and so that seems to work out really well also.
Okay, well, that's very exciting. And, it's neat to be able to see that whole data stream
Hmm.
and be able to then look animal to animal and see how your environment's impacting them.
Hmm.
So, to me,
And
that's one of the
yes.
exciting points.
Yes, and I may not have answered that question, but Maggie brought it up also. But just the idea of having the data to look back clearly, what were the health trends, what were the health events, and then now as we have those animals enter the milking herd, to really see what other studies have already seen, but to really verify that the success of having those healthy calves has really brought that benefit into the dairy herd and the milking cow side.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, that sounds great then. And let's see. We don't have any more comments or questions. So thank you very much, Lori. We really appreciate it. And thank you for being here today. And if we have any more questions, our folks I'm sure, will email and ask questions.
That
So
would be
thank you.
great. Thank you.
All right. And if you guys have more questions, I'm sure that you will hang around and be able to answer them as well. So now joining us is going to be Dr. Larry Roth from Agrarian Solutions, who is going to talk about enhancing dairy reproductive success when cows are challenged by mycotoxins, which is a really timely question. So, Dr. Roth, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Todd. So let's have a conversation about the interaction of mycotoxins and dairy reproductive success. In a subsequent slide, I'm going to define mycotoxins. So let's start by what do I mean by reproductive success? Getting the cow pregnant and staying pregnant. I think that reproductive success is one of the most important economic determinants on the dairy. It's not just the cost of having to repeatedly rebreed the cow, be it semen and labor costs. It's not just the cost or the value of a dairy replacement or a beef on dairy calf, but reproductive success also determines our days in milk on the farm and what our level of milk production is going to be. So let's talk some more here about mycotoxins. What are mycotoxins? Mycotoxins are toxic secondary metabolites produced by moles. Moles are wanting to grow and they don't want anybody else to live in their neighborhood. So it's their means of competitive exclusion to protect their niche or their environment. Moles could care less about the plant that they're growing on, the animal that consumes them, or even us humans. They're simply trying to dominate the environment in which they live. So here's a little figure that kind of gets at when do mold infections occur. And it just seems that some of our modern agronomic practices, we get more molds and mycotoxins than in the past. We think about good agronomic practices start with some crop residue, organic matter being on the surface of the soil. Well, that serves as a reservoir of mold spores to inoculate the little green leaf, the coleoptile, when it first emerges from the soil. And then we get spores that blow in, and then we get weather. Might be hot and dry, might be cool and wet, or just variable. We should stop and think that anything that challenges plant health tips the balance toward the molds and gives them an opportunity to grow. Insects come along and cause damage to the plant. That reduces the vigor of the plant. And then we have harvest. Well, is the harvest on a very timely basis, or is it cool and wet? Is it stop and go due to weather or mechanical breakdowns? All of these situations give an opportunities for mold to grow. But it's not just the mold count that leads to mycotoxins. More importantly, it's stresses that occur to the molds. With some molds, it's going to be hot, dry, such as to the fusarium and aspergillus, that's going to produce aflatoxin. It could be cool, wet conditions that lead to the production of DON and T2 and zearalenone, or warm, humid conditions that lead to the production of fumonisin. So I really think that it's important that we monitor growing conditions, but we have to also think about what particular stresses come at what time during the growth cycle and harvest cycle that can lead to mycotoxins being produced. Here's something that we're really starting to see, and that is the occurrence of multiple mycotoxins. And let's think of an individual mycotoxin as a stressor on the cow, as we'll talk about in a subsequent slide. So when we have multiple mycotoxins occurring, it's multiple stressors on the cow. And we just see increasing numbers of these multiple mycotoxins occurring. Here's some data that came out of the state of Michigan looking at the number of mycotoxins on dry corn samples. Wow, look at that. Even up as many as 10 different mycotoxins that occur on a sample of dry corn. Let's stop for a moment and talk about what might be happening to some of this, shall I call it, dirty corn. Well, if we know, as the row crop producer, that we have Our corn is going to get tested for mycotoxins when we take it to the feed mill or a place for milling for human use. We're going to take it to some place that doesn't do that type of testing. And so what we see happening with some of our corn byproducts, such as distillers grains, is that these mycotoxins get concentrated by a factor of 3. The mycotoxins aren't destroyed during the processing to create the byproducts. They're just concentrated. So let's keep in mind, what are the conditions in our area for the crops that we're producing? What are the conditions in areas where byproducts may be coming from? And we always need to be doing some testing. I'm a big advocate for testing. I like to see dairies sample on a monthly basis, sample their fermented feeds, be it corn silage, high moisture corn. If they're feeding their own corn, maybe testing that as well. But where we're most likely to pick up mycotoxins is going to be in the TMR. That's where we have mycotoxins coming from byproducts that we're feeding, as well as our own feeds. I also encourage folks to look at sampling their feeds at harvest, going into the corn silage bunker, going into the bin, so that we know what our inventory is. If I've got a 30,000 ton bunker of corn silage and I was sampling it going into storage and fermentation, I'm going to have an idea about the nutrient quality. I'm also going to have an idea about the mycotoxin level. Mycotoxins are not destroyed during the fermentation process, and during a poor, prolonged fermentation with plenty of oxygen available, we will actually see the mycotoxin levels go up. So test and then test some more so that we know what we have for levels. And here's the main mycotoxins that we are dealing with in North America. Aflatoxin. We typically don't see that much aflatoxin anymore because the corn breeders have done a very good job of breeding corn that is relatively drought tolerant. But we'll see aflatoxin if we're feeding a lot of cotton products or peanut products coming out of the South. And I think of aflatoxin as the mycotoxin that attacks the liver. Think of the liver as the body's biochemical factory. And if our biochemical factory is under attack, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. Milk is regularly sampled for aflatoxin because it is a class 1 carcinogen. How about DON? We see tremendous levels of DON here in North America. And I think of DON as the disruptor. It disrupts the microbial balance in the rumen and in the hind gut. It is a drain on nutrients, as we'll see here in just a moment, and interferes with gut integrity. Then we have zearalenone. I call zearalenone the imposter mycotoxin because it mimics zearalenone. It ties up some of the estrogen receptors. So some folks will call zearalenone the reproductive mycotoxin, and yeah, it does interfere with reproduction, but so do the others, as we're going to be talking about in the rest of our presentation. And then we have T2 and H2. I call them the assassin. They are perhaps the most deadly of the mycotoxins, not quite as common as some of the others, but they like to go after the high turnover cells, such as those that line the digestive tract. So we have reduced gut integrity. We see more incidents of bloody diarrhea. And if we have damage occurring to the digestive tract lining, we're more likely to get pathogens and other mycotoxins into the body and migrating to the liver. And the liver is going to be trying to detoxify those compounds, and that interferes with some of the nutrient processing. And then we have fumonisin. Interestingly, we're seeing higher levels of this mycotoxin in recent years. And I call it the saboteur because it comes in and tries to really damage the liver, tries to damage the small intestine. So it maybe sets up the body to be more easily attacked by some of the other mycotoxins. So we need to be thinking about what are the mycotoxins that we're dealing with, and how many of them, and how do they come together. Hey, let's talk about digestive tract integrity. As a nutritionist, I think that the digestive tract is the most important part of the animal. Feed a great diet, and then set up the digestive tract to make use of those nutrients and absorb them. On the right hand here, you see an electron micrograph of the small intestine villi. That could be the villi for a young calf, for a mature cow, or even for us. We have all these finger-like projections to increase the absorption of nutrients, but the cells lining those villi serve as kind of a castle wall. Their objective is to protect the body. See, you take one drop of fluid from the digestive tract, and there's more bacteria in that little drop than there are people on the face of the earth. And there's a constant battle between the good organisms and the bad organisms. And so the small intestine lining has an important job to keep the pathogens in the digestive tract. They're also responsible for keeping the mycotoxins in the tract. But it's these cells that absorb mycotoxins, and mycotoxins are going to seek to kill these cells. And then we get heat stress. We get other conditions that lead to leaky gut. Let's look at this in maybe a little bit different way with this little drawing down here. We go from the left where we have normal lining of the tract. We have our villi or epithelial cells, and then note the junctions between the cells. Those are supposed to be called tight junctions because they're tight. But if the animal becomes dehydrated, we have shrinkage of the intestinal lining cells, and the tight junctions no longer are tight. They become a disrupted junction. And what had been a barrier, think of it as mortar between our castle blocks in the castle wall, and now becomes open and becomes an interstate highway for pathogens, mycotoxins, and other bad stuff to get into the body. So we got to be thinking about how do we protect our tight junctions. And there's ways that we can do that. Things with phytogenics, things with hydration. And then we have this transcellular. That is where bacteria, viruses, mycotoxins actually cause death of the intestinal lining cells. And that block of the castle wall is now gone. And it's that much easier for bad stuff to get into the body. So here's where the battle takes place for liver health. Here's where the battle takes place for protecting the immune system. If we lose this battle at the digestive tract lining, now there's nutrients required to repair the gut lining. There's nutrients required to repair the liver, which is going to be under attack from mycotoxins and pathogens. And those nutrients are going to be diverted from more productive uses. And then we need to think about the immune system. I think of the animal's immune system, or our immune system, as being the military that defends the body against invading agents. Well, this military requires glucose. And we need glucose for a variety of uses, as we'll talk about. And the immune system also uses nutrients, also requires antioxidants. So the more we lose control of the digestive tract lining, the more reallocation we have of nutrients, the more nutrients that are required to supporting the immune system. What could be wrong with that type of picture? Well, let's look at it here. This slide is looking at nutrient allocation in the dairy cow. Just as we budget our finances and our time, the cow budgets or allocates its nutrients. And so on the left here, we see when things are good, there's nutrients that goes for maintenance, for milk production, reproduction, and defense. But whenever we have metabolic challenges, this could be acidosis, could be ketosis, could be metritis, mastitis, could be respiratory distress. Whenever we have a metabolic challenge, the body now, in an effort to stay alive, shifts more of the nutrients to simple defense, staying alive. We don't have as many nutrients for milk production. We don't have the nutrients needed for reproduction, the main topic of our conversation here today. So it's important that the animal mounts an inflammatory response whenever it is challenged. But we have to have a strong inflammatory response to resolve the insult, resolve the challenge, so that nutrients can now go back toward productive purposes. Hey, it costs nutrients to feed the cow. Those nutrients cost money. And as long as that money or nutrients are going to simple defense, we're losing out. We don't have money going to the profit-making practices of milk production or reproduction, or with some of our animals, depending on the stage of growth, to growth. Here's one of my favorite slides. This is the Britt hypothesis. And this comes from the 1992 bovine practitioners' proceedings, and it has appeared since in different forms. But basically, it's asking us to think about the follicles that are produced by the cow and when they are actually initiated, and to think about the nutrients that are required. One of the key nutrients required for follicle development is glucose. The glucose isn't used so much by the follicle as an energy source, but rather as a carbon source. The follicle is very fast growing and needs carbon to do that. So glucose is shunted away from other purposes, such as the immune system, making lactose for milk, and other purposes. The glucose is simply going over here to help with follicle growth. But if we have these other challenges taking place, now it's the immune system, its defense, that is soaking up all the glucose. Our follicles don't develop like they should, or they're an unhealthy follicle, and reproduction suffers. So here's the Britt hypothesis, which I think has survived the test of time and is said in different ways today by many different researchers. But negative energy balance and associated changes in metabolic hormones impair follicular development. So I think so many of the reproductive challenges that we see with dairy cows today are summed up in the previous slide, showing how nutrients are reallocated, and this slide showing the tremendous demand that the follicles have for glucose. And I think that sets the basis for our challenges with mycotoxins. If mycotoxins are destroying digestive tract integrity, we've got to shuttle nutrients there. If we don't have the glucose for follicle development, because glucose is over here dealing with the mycotoxin challenges, follicle development doesn't happen. So to me, it all comes to what can we do to defend the digestive tract integrity against the mycotoxin challenges. So for a long time, nutritionists, be it ruminant or non-ruminant, have selected different feed ingredients and have said, hey, these can bind mycotoxins. Well, the Cahal et al. Research group has done a tremendous amount of research looking at these different feed ingredients, and you see classes of them here on the left-hand side of this chart. And they took 68 different peer-reviewed studies, put them together in a meta-analysis. And this is peer-reviewed research that appeared in the Journal of Animal Science in December of 2022. Cahal et al. Has also published their research over a number of years at the dairy science and animal science meetings, but they put everything together in this nice meta-analysis for the Journal of Animal Science. So here's how this research was conducted. Take these different feed ingredients singularly by themselves, mix them in an in vitro situation with one of these mycotoxins across the top at a pH of 6.5. Kind of duplicate what's going on in the rumen. Let it mix for several hours, and then wash it, shall we say, at a pH of 2 to kind of duplicate the stomach in non-ruminants or the abomasum in ruminants. And then what percentage of the mycotoxins remain bound to these different feed ingredients? Well, you can see from this peer-reviewed research that aflatoxin can be bound by just about anything except a yeast cell wall. DON, which we see to be very common here in North America, really isn't bound by much of anything. We come over to zearalenone, maybe our number 2 mycotoxin challenge, really not bound by anything other than charcoal. We can say much the same for fumonisin, ochratoxin, which is more of a tropical mycotoxin, and T2. Now, so this is the bad news, that our traditional feed ingredients, which have been used to bind or protect the animal against mycotoxins, are relatively ineffective. But the really bad news that I can send to you if you send me an email, but is available in Journal of Dairy Science, is that these feed ingredients are probably more effective at tying up or binding, reducing the bioavailability of vitamin E, the amino acids lysine, methionine, and threonine. It has some effect on minerals as well. Well, shoot, those are all the types of things that we need to mount an immune response to the mycotoxins. So I guess what I'm saying is that the traditional feed ingredients that we have used to protect against mycotoxins aren't that effective against protecting against these challengers. They tie up the nutrients that the producer is paying good money for and leaving the animal exposed. So what are we going to do? Well, at Agrarian Solutions, we have a relatively unique cell wall deficient bacteria technology that we have been using for 27 years to provide mycotoxin protection to a wide range of species, non-ruminants as well as ruminants. And this is an independently conducted study that was done to evaluate the product DTX, which is the cell wall deficient bacteria technology, supplementation to early lactation cows, and looking at milk production and reproductive performance. So this was conducted at a 3,600 cow dairy in New York State. There was experience with conducting feeding trials. It was an independent group of research-minded vets that actually conducted this work. So there was a control group and a group that received this, I'm going to go ahead and call it probiotic technology. This went on for about 9 months. We sampled TMR samples on a biweekly basis, and our objective was to evaluate milk production and reproduction for the first 150 days in milk. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to say that we had an improvement in milk production, and we're going to focus today on reproductive performance. This study utilized over 920 cows that were randomly assigned at calving to either the control group, standard management and feeding practices, or to the DTX group that got the probiotic technology. And so we had first, second, and third and greater lactation cows, but over 920 cows utilized in this study. The reproduction protocol was that all cows were synchronized for service at 73 days in milk. Those cows at first service received an embryo. 90% of the first lactation cows did. 99% of the second and third lactation cows received an embryo. And so a very aggressive ET program. 100% of the fourth and greater lactation cows received conventional beef semen. Those first, second, and third lactation cows that did not receive an embryo received sexed high genetic value Holstein semen. First preg check was 28 to 34 days post-service, be it ET or AI, and then reconfirmations were at 61 to 67 days post-service. So when we look at Dawn, sampled throughout the study, we see there was no statistical difference between the two groups. On a part per billion basis, we were a little bit over 1,500 parts per billion, which I think most nutritionists would call that in a high risk category, just based upon Dawn itself. But these cows were also challenged by zearalenone. Zearalenone did not differ between the two research groups over the course of the study and averaged 147 parts per billion. And we would consider that to be a medium risk level. So a high risk level of Dawn, a medium risk level of zearalenone. So we got multiple mycotoxins, multiple stressors on these cows, and we have zearalenone, the imposter mycotoxin, to tie up estrogen receptors. So let's see here what happened for reproduction. Here's a summary of all of the lactations together. And we saw the same trend in all of the lactations, but just for the sake of brevity, I've combined it all here. You can see what percentages of the cows that freshened in the two groups were bred. Some of the cows were called do not breed. So what this column here does is it follows these 407 cows that were bred, going all of the way down through the final preg check at 61 to 67 days post-service. This column here follows these 422 cows who freshened and went on to DTX right after freshening, and follows them all of the way through their final preg check, again, 61 to 67 days post-service. You can see there was no difference between the two groups for cows who were bred off of estrus, those who received embryo, and those who were bred off of a timed AI. So let's look down here at pregnancies per service. So think of this as a percentage. What percentage of the services resulted in a pregnancy here at this point, which would have been 28 to 34 days post-service. 37.7% of the services resulted in a pregnancy for the control cows, but those receiving the DTX probiotic technology was at 45%, a statistical improvement. You can see the pregnancy losses between first preg check and second preg check, but at the final preg check, again, 61 to 67 days post-service, 30.3% of the services resulted in a pregnancy for control cows, but for those supplemented the DTX probiotic technology, 36.4%, or 6.1% percentage units more pregnancies per service for those getting the DTX. And it was at the 0.06 level, that would be a strong trend. Then we come over here to breaking it out by artificial insemination versus embryo transfer. Wow. Supplementing the probiotic technology at the first preg check resulted in 7 percentage units higher. When we come back at the final preg check, if my math is right, that's going to be what? 9, or yeah, it's going to be over 10 percentage units higher pregnancies per service for the cows getting the DTX technology. So when we start thinking about what is a pregnancy worth, is it the value of that $1,500 day-old calf? Is it the value of the dairy replacement? Is it the value of not having to come back and breed the cow again and keeping our days in milk low? But that's a pretty strong economic improvement right there. And then we look at embryo transfer. Almost an 8 percentage unit improvement in pregnancy at the first preg check, and a 4.3 percentage unit improvement at the second preg check. The dairy valued some of these embryos at $2,000. So turning one of those embryos into a pregnancy is a very strong economic incentive. So how did all of this happen? If we're able to improve gut integrity, if we're able to spare nutrients from having to defend against the mycotoxins to go to more productive purposes, such as milk production, where we saw an improvement with multiple lactation cows, and go to improving reproductive success, which we saw here on the previous slide and this slide. So in our conversation today, I've tried to show that mycotoxin contamination is a major factor in dairy nutrition. When we look at common practices of minimum till, no till, high planting rates, we're seeing that molds are present. Challenges are taking place weather-wise that lead to molds producing mycotoxins and multiple mycotoxins. We've looked at an independent peer-reviewed study that shows that supplementing certain feed ingredients to bind mycotoxins has mixed results. Poor results for protection, and unfortunately does tie up some nutrients. And then we looked at how supplementing a unique probiotic technology enhanced artificial insemination pregnancy rates by 29%. And we also looked at how that same probiotic technology improved embryo transfer pregnancy rates by almost 16%. So for you to walk away with a realization, mycotoxins are an issue with ruminants. We need to have an aggressive sampling program to determine if we need to employ a mycotoxin mitigation strategy, determine if that strategy is successful, or if it is reducing nutrient bioavailability. And I would contend that here is a probiotic technology that under research conditions improve reproductive success. So, hey, I appreciate your participation today. And do we have any questions that we can answer?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roth. So we have one question already about, can you briefly talk about how the cows, or excuse me, that was the second question, sorry. You mentioned research about the common mycotoxin binding items that binding the mycotoxins, but also binding some key nutrients. Can you restate or let us know where we can find that reference for that research?
Yeah, Cahal et al., Journal of Dairy Science 2020. They did a very nice review looking at research that they had done in their lab and others had done for some of these common feed ingredients that folks use for mycotoxin protection. And then looked at B vitamins, which may not be that important to us in the ruminant world, but are important in the non-ruminant world. And then looked at vitamin E and the amino acids, lysine, methionine, and threonine. So Journal of Dairy Science, Cahal et al., 2020, or contact me and I can send that to you.
Okay. Well, we had another question that popped up on if you would briefly talk about whether cows respond differently to mycotoxin challenges depending on lactation stage.
Perfect. Great question. How might cows respond differently to mycotoxins depending upon lactation stage? Let me expand that a little bit to include the dry period. During the dry period, so often we don't think about mycotoxins, but this is when the cow is going through determining colostrum quantity and quality. She's getting ready for the next lactation. So, what is the load put on the immune system at that point? She's also putting nutrients into the calf growing inside of her. This is time of greatest fetal growth. So we have extra competition for nutrients at that point. So for dry cows, we have the competition for fetal growth and colostrum quantity and quality being determined. For first lactation cows, they're still growing. So there's that competition for growth for nutrients. And then as we get into our higher production cows, they have such a drive to produce milk. They're going to do whatever it takes to do that. And that's where the glucose going to lactose comes into play. We can simply say, Todd, no glucose, no lactose, no milk, because of lactose being a relatively fixed percentage in milk. So, what are the challenges on the cow, and how is she going to respond to those different stressors? Oh, and then let's put heat stress on top of that. Heat stress further leading to leaky gut and all of the immune challenges that come there. So, and then let's think about our mycotoxins, more of the T2 and fumonisin affecting the liver, or is it more of the DON affecting rumen bacteria and digestive tract lining and the liver to a little bit? Or is the mycotoxin in question zearalenone, the imposter mycotoxin, blocking the estrogen receptors? So that's how I would look at different responses to the mycotoxins depending what stage of production that we're at.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roth. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Nancy Heder from the Rangan Group, who will talk about brewer's yeast supplements in dairy nutrition and herd productivity. So please take it away, Nancy. So you're muted at the moment, Nancy. I'm sorry. You're muted still, Nancy.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
No worries. I did it too.
Thank you, Dr. Calloway. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Nancy Grothwell-Heater, and I'm with Rangan Livestock Nutrition, and I serve as the technical sales manager for our livestock yeast platform. Some of you may know this technology from our prior days as being the FL Emmert Company or Wilbur Ellis Nutrition. And as Dr. Calloway said, I'll be visiting with you today about brewer's yeast supplements and their applications in dairy nutrition. If you want to move to the next slide. So to go through the agenda and the topics that I'm going to cover today, I'm going to give you a brief history of how we became Rangan, talk about the science of our products and how they work, and then share a couple trial data, some results with you, and then also just in closing, go through some practical applications. So as we move on to the next slide, for our listeners who may not be familiar with Rangan Livestock Nutrition, our livestock yeast business actually has a very unique story. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that our platform actually traces back to 1881 when the FL Emmert family started the business as a saloon. And so at this time, farmers were buying spent brewer's grain from the breweries to feed their livestock. And when the breweries would come into the saloon, they would complain that the farmers were always late picking up the brewer's yeast grains. So this gave the FL Emmert family an idea to start a new business. And they started buying the spent brewer's grains from the breweries and reselling to the farmers. And so if you can move to the next slide. In the 1960s, that's when they really began developing the foundational brewer's yeast products that we have today. And so these products are utilized through the co-products from the brewing industry. And so while the Rangan Livestock Nutrition name may be new, the platform itself and the yeast supplements have really been around for more than 55 years. And so they have a long history of serving the industry and working with feed mills and animal nutrition companies. Historically, a lot of the focus was on the companion animal or the pet nutrition side. And so even though we've had a lot of great customers on the livestock side, more recently when Wilbur Ellis purchased us in 2022, is when they really added some new focus and new research efforts to the livestock yeast platform. Then last year in August of 2025, we were acquired and we became Rangan Livestock Nutrition. And so as we move forward, we are really happy to have some additional resources for continued research, for technical and sales support, and also for marketing. So as we move to the next slide, I'll visit with you a little bit about a couple of our products. So we have products that vary in protein levels and on different functional carriers. And we have two main products that are on our Improve line for livestock customers. And I'll briefly mention our Improve 28 product. And then the rest of the time, I'm going to focus more on Improve MX. And I'll share a couple of research trials and the results of those where we're using Improve MX. So both products really stem from the same place. They start with, the liquid brewer's yeast that is a byproduct of the commercial beer fermentation. And they both go through the same dry roasting proprietary process where we dry our products onto a functional carrier. The Improve M8 product is a 28% protein product that the carrier is soybean meal and corn germ or corn gluten meal carrier, excuse me. And then with our Improve MX product, it's really a highly concentrated product that's 40% protein. It's fed at 7 to 14 grams. And the functional carrier for Improve MX is canola meal. Both products, have applications where some customers prefer one or the other. So a lot of it is personal preference, but where our customers are really using Improve MX could be in like receiving rations, creep rations, where they're really wanting to drive intake. And then Improve MX is generally used in more high performance, applications such as in dairies, feedlots. But we have customers who use them interchangeably. We do have some customers using Improve 28 to help drive cows into the robot because they feel, the palatability just really helps them there. But both products are highly palatable. As we move to the next slide, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the science behind our products. And the next slide will go through the serial repitching process. And so this is something that I feel is very interesting if you're not familiar with brewer's yeast, because brewer's yeast really live a different life than other yeast. So they're introduced into a commercial brewery where they ferment the beer. And so at the end of the cycle, the yeast biomass is harvested and repitched, or we call this serial repitching, where it's used across multiple batches of beer. So that could be 20 to 25 different batches. During this process, that's where the cell really undergoes stress. It replicates. And as it does this, it continues to produce bud scars. And so this stress really helps to thicken and reinforce those cell walls. And so that structural integrity is what really gives the yeast an advantage. So as these yeast, thicken and have that better structural integrity, then it gives them an advantage. So they're better equipped to survive the journey through the digestive tract and reach the hindgut, where then they can really help to support the animal's digestion and microbial environment. So as we move to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the functional carriers. And so I've kind of mentioned part of this process before, where we take the liquid brewer's yeast and we have a proprietary process where we dry roast it onto a functional carrier. And so we really think, this gives an advantage to our products because it creates, really a system that allows the products to be uniformly distributed into the TMR or a pellet. And, it also, just helps the yeast when, for blending purposes. So as I mentioned, our ImproveMX product does contain 40% protein. And, listed on the right-hand part of the slide, it is an inactive yeast, and we classify it as a postbiotic. It is part of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae class. And so as we move to the next slide, I'll visit a little bit more about really some of the components. And I briefly mentioned, the three things that it is. It's a brewing origin yeast, classified as a postbiotic. And we feel that the functional carrier really helps provide a nutritional system. So how the product works is when it is eaten, then it really helps to support that microbial balance. And it helps stabilize fermentation. And as I've mentioned, the functional carriers are an added benefit. So when we look at the outcomes that we see, and this is usually across species, we get better digestion and fiber utilization, better nutrient capture, and just more consistent performance. And so we really say that the products help to utilize more nutrients that are in the ration. And then if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through a couple of trials and share the data with you from them. As we go to the next slide, I'm going to first talk to you about a commercial dairy study. And so this was a 47-day commercial study that was conducted in the spring of 2019 at a dairy farm in Indiana. There were 178 Holstein cows that were assigned to one of two treatments. So a control group with no yeast supplementation, or the treatment group that were fed ImproveMX at 14 grams per head per day. So this farm did use a Leadley robotic milking system, and the supplement was delivered through the robot. The cows were eating the same diet pre-trial that they ate during the trial. The only difference was the treatment groups received the ImproveMX. The cows were balanced across groups based on days in milk, lactation number, and initial milk yield. So one thing just to note as well is that it was a high performance TMR where 62.2 pounds of dry matter intake were fed per day. It was high in non-fiber carbohydrates, and they fed high moisture corn, and the ADF was on the lower end. So as we move to the next slide, I'll share some of the outcomes. And as I mentioned, this was based on 2019 data. But what we saw was that the cow supplemented with ImproveMX produced 3.7 more pounds of milk per cow per day compared to the control group. And so that was a significant difference. We also saw that energy-corrected milk improved by 5.2 pounds per cow per day, and that fat yield increased by 0.26 pound per day, along with protein yield by 1/10 of a pound per day. And all of this was statistically significant. Dry matter, however, was not statistically similar between the groups. So as we move to the next slide, we did look at, the 2019 data versus the 2026 data, just to kind of help give an estimate, of what these outcomes would look like in today's market. And so if you're looking at class 3 prices, they are narrower in range, and many operations have tighter margins compared to the last few years. And then if you look at the components, USDA data shows protein tracking at approximately $2.51 per pound and fat at approximately $1.95 per pound. And then one thing we are hearing from producers is, if we use a product, what is the return? So as we move to the next slide, we wanted to really take a look, as I mentioned, at some of the 2026 pricing just to see how this would compare to the outcomes we saw in 2019. And so these are estimates, but if you look at the data, the trial showed an additional 3.7 pounds of milk per cow per day. So at 21 cents per pound, that's an additional 78 cents per cow per day for milk. The additional 0.26 pounds of fat at $1.95 per pound adds 51 cents. The additional tenth of a pound of protein at $2.51 per pound adds 25 cents. So that would bring the gross value to $1.54 per cow per day. But we did want to look at the costs that are also incorporated and the input variables. And so one thing we saw with this was that the Lely system caused pellet intake to run about half a pound per day higher in the treatment cows than in the controls. And so they were actually eating closer to 19 grams of MX per day versus the 14 grams that was the recommended feeding level. So we wanted to account for that and added the 8 cents per day. The product cost, and this is purchased through distribution and delivered to the farm at the recommended feeding rate, would have been around 7 cents per day. However, I did not adjust this for freight. So based on what freight differences we might see in 2019 versus 2026, that would be something to take into consideration as well. But net return per cow, given this scenario and these estimates, would have been around $1.39. So if you take a look at 100 cows, which is up in the right-hand corner at those values, then you could see what the return would be per month and then over 90 days. So again, this is just an estimate. And I know a lot of people look for starting points when they're evaluating products. So I wanted to include this data just so that you would have an estimate, if it's something you would consider in your operation. As we move to the next slide, I also wanted to share the response that we saw because it was pretty immediate and seen in the first week on milk production. And so the one thing to note, which is down at the bottom of the slide, is that there was some missing pretrial data. And so what they did was they used, so it starts at week 1 because days 1 through 3, the data did not exist. So it was used to verify the groups that were balanced at the start, and they covariantly adjusted the weekly values. So you're not seeing the raw unadjusted baseline. Basically, you're seeing the adjusted data. But that is why the data starts at week 1. So just so that you have an understanding of that. And if anyone would like to see a copy of this research trial, I'd be happy to email it to you. Just feel free to message me. But we did see a significant improvement in response during that first week. And it continued all the way through the lactation period, even with the natural decline that is seen towards the end of the lactation period. As we move to the next slide, I am going to share a feedlot trial that we just recently completed. There were 2 pens, a pen of Holstein and a pen of beef on dairy, that were included in this evaluation. So as we move to the next slide, to give you a little background information on this trial, there were a little over 1,300 head in this evaluation, and the steers were purchased. There were some heifers as well, so excuse me for saying steers, but these cattle were purchased, a lot of them in sale barns out east, then brought back to Iowa where they were commingled and assigned to treatment pens. So this was a pretty real world, commercial environment. They were distributed across 25 lots. And so basically they were fed either Improve MX, starting out at 14 grams per head per day for the first 56 days, and then dropped down to 7 grams per head per day, or the control received no supplement. And so our findings, I wanted to share the numerical weight advantage. So even though this wasn't statistically significant, the treatment calves did have a numerical advantage in weight during the whole feeding phase. They ended up 94 pounds heavier. Statistically, we did see fewer pulls in period 3 with the treatment calves. And we also saw a lower cost of gain for period 4 in the treatment calves, so $42 per hundredweight. We also saw a ration by time interaction on cost of gain overall that was statistically significant for the treatment calves. And so basically the control calves started out at a higher cost of gain or at a lower cost of gain, and then their costs went higher, while the Improve MX treated calves started out at a higher cost of gain and went lower during the feeding phase. The other item that I wanted to note is that we did see a 1.6 decrease in dry matter intake per pound of gain for the treatment calves. And so while this was not significant, it was a trend that we felt was important. And it's something that we're going to explore more with an additional feedlot trial that we just started. We're doing a single source trial where the cattle will be fed on smart feeders. So I think it's going to be really interesting to look closer at some of these outcomes in a single source set of cattle. As we move on to the next slide, I'm going to just kind of close with some practical applications and just summarize some of what we've talked about so far. So as we move to the next slide, in closing, I just wanted to share our feeding recommendations. And we recommend feeding 14 grams in a dairy operation where you have high performance animals. And again, if you would move to the next slide, please. On the delivery, it can be used in a TMR or in the pellet. And it does have, a very easy way of blending into the ration, as I've mentioned. Our Improve MX product is 40% protein, and it is on a functional carrier of canola meal. And so on the right-hand side, you can see some practical applications. And, my hope today was really just to give you an understanding of our brewer's yeast supplements and what the field research that we have so far says, along with some practical applications. So I thank you for your engagement and for the opportunity to be here today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy. So I'm going to kind of ask one of those bigger questions because you kind of bring everything together here at the end. Where do you think some of our biggest challenges are in fitting these brewer yeasts into our rations?
Well, I think the one key thing with these products is that they are, an easy to deliver product. So, I think depending upon the application, we do have different product types with different protein levels and different carriers so that nutritionists and producers can really select the right product for the right application. So, I think some of that is just education and helping producers select the product that really fits their needs.
Okay. Well, let's see. We have a question from the audience on how do you see brewer's yeast fitting into a nutrition program? Is it something you'd consider consistently adding across all lactation stages, or is it more of a targeted tool for specific challenges or stress periods?
Well, we have producers that are feeding it across all lactation stages, and where we really see results pretty quickly. That's one benefit where I think you can start feeding it, and literally within a week you can see some benefit, to adding it to your ration.
Okay. Let's see, we have another question that says, regarding the improvements in milk components, based on your field experience, what all you've seen, how quickly do producers usually see a result?
Yes, and so what we've seen, and kind of the same response we saw in the dairy trial that I shared is usually within a week, definitely by 2 weeks, but usually we see that response, within a couple weeks.
Okay, that's a really rapid turnaround on that.
Yes.
All righty. Well, we do not have more questions, and I know we're a little behind when we told people we'd be done. So thank you very much, Nancy. Really appreciate it. and very good thoughts on how we can actually utilize brewers. It's kind of gotten pushed down behind distillers grains, but it brings a lot of other things to the table. So, well, in order to close our event, I want to thank every one of you who attended and who stayed with us until the end. It's been a pleasure to have you and to learn from these experts this afternoon. Of course, I want to thank our speakers who took their time out of their day to share their information with us and their expertise. And once again, I want to thank our sponsors who made this event possible: Agrarian Solutions, Agriplastics, Cow Manager, DietForge.ai, InBarn, Priority IAC, and Rangan Corporation, or Rangan Group, excuse me. So thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day. I hope to see you all soon or hear from you again very soon. So thank you very much, y'all. Have a great day.